If you were challenged to use a specific set of items in your DIYs, what would you create? This is the challenge that Kendra from Late Night Creations has given both myself and Leanne from Simply Enjoying Crafting. So stick around and see what items we were challenged with and what we each created with these items. Let's get started. I'm Natalie with Sparks of Joy Studio, and in today's video, I am participating in the 5th Sunday Craft with Friends event brought to us by Late Night Creations. Kendra has given us a challenge of using 5 specific items within our DIYs. Now, all of these items are meant to be upcycled or repurposed trash. This frame, so an 8 by 10 frame, was one of the 5 challenge items. And I found this at the Goodwill outlet bins. It did have a picture in it, which I thought was nice, but I have another idea for this frame. So I'm going to remove the picture and the glass from this frame, and we are going to make the color of it a little bit more my style. I start by giving the entire frame one nice thick coat of cashmere by Fusion. Now, I know that some of that dark green that's underneath is going to pop through, even though I sprayed it with a Rust-Oleum matte clear sealer, but that's okay because I am going to go over this in a different color in the next step. Once that cashmere paint was dry, I took some weathered wood by DIY and I'm going to paint on top of the entire frame with this weathered wood. I start by doing kind of a messy coat, I should say. I was looking for more of a dry brushed effect, but the streaks of the brush were too obvious. So I decided to coat it completely, which took, I would say, one full coat and then about a half a coat where I touched up the places that weren't that didn't get as much coverage. Now I'm taking a wet rag and I'm going to wet distress the entire frame. I start just on the edges and I'm going, as you can see, very lightly, but then I decided that I really wanted this to distress back pretty significantly to bring out a lot of that cashmere that's underneath. So I do end up going in a lot heavier as I continue on with this technique. Once it was sealed, I added in this artwork that I had gotten for my husband for our anniversary a couple years back, and this is it. Sometimes a project feels so simple when you are working on it that you don't feel like it should be done yet. But in this case, I feel like this frame is exactly how I wanted it to look, and I do love the simplicity of it. For our next project, this is a candle tin. We all have the exact same one. Kendra gave one to both Leanne and myself. And my original plan was to turn this into a riser. So I started by scuff sanding the bottom of the candle tin because I had intended to flip it upside down and then place a piece of like a wood round on top of it. That was originally where I was going to go with this, but you will see very quickly that I switched gears. I painted the base of the tin around the entire outside, and then I ended up painting the inside in White Swan by DIY. This did require a few coats, and I, between coats, decided to spray seal it just to ensure that the paint adhered well. I ended up switching gears as I was thinking about this project, and I decided to glue the base of this candle tin to the lid. And I'm doing it so it almost looks like it's a little bowl inside of a saucer. So I go ahead and glue this together, and then I am going to put some weight on it with a stack of books and allow that to sit overnight until the glue is completely dry and it is permanently adhered. I took the Halloween Blocks 2021, which is a Roy Cycle decoupage paper, and I'm going to find some of the parts of this that are not that don't have like animals or an actual item on it, just the stuff that looks like a really pretty background. And instead of cutting with scissors the paper, I'm going to just very lightly dampen it with a wet brush. So it's a brush just dipped in a little bit of water, and very slowly tear around the pieces that I want to use to decoupage onto my little bowl. I then get out my liquid patina and start the decoupage process, but I realized very, very quickly some things that I would have to do to alter how I typically would decoupage with how I'm going to do it for this piece. First, I had trimmed the paper too short, so it didn't actually go all the way from the top to the bottom of the side of the bowl, which was one thing I had to figure out how to handle. But I also, because of the way that the bowl is wider at the top and then kind of narrower as it goes down, in addition to the ridges on the inside, that texture that's on the inside, this was not going to decoupage very easily. And so I decided I was going to then just rip pieces of the decoupage paper and kind of overlap them to ensure that everything is covered, but give it that more, I guess, rustic look, or allow it to kind of work with the piece. I did decide to add these bugs to the part on the other side of the bowl where there was a where the two pieces of the decoupage paper did not connect. So I just overlapped that and gave it allowed it to like mold into the rest of the decoupage paper. I use the same method of ripping the pieces of decoupage paper from that same piece. I might have had some other pieces, other scraps that I had laying around too. And I am decoupaging around the lip of the bowl and then the inside of the bowl, making sure that the piece that's in the center has some nice character to it. So I definitely I filled in that middle part first and then worked on getting the edges filled in around the sides. Now you will see that there is still some white in the corners that I could not get to. I do try to come in and use some of the decoupage paper in those little piece like grooves, but in places where it just was too hard to get to, I decided to take some paint and just dab it gently in those places and give it again a little bit more definition from just having the ripped paper there without anything else. I also used that same black paint to paint the rim of that lid, which has now become the base of our little trinket bowl. And this is Cast Iron by Fusion, which is an all-in-one paint. Once that paint was dry, I got out some of this gator hide, which is a Dixie Belle product. And what it is meant to do is to be a sealer, but to act as a much thicker sealer that also offers some water resistance. So I saw Lady Poe Designs use this on one of her projects about, I don't know, maybe a month ago or so. And I really, what she had described on that channel, and then when I spoke with her about it afterwards, she said it is a very powerful product. So I did pick this up from Julie at Julie's Designs and Signs, and I am trying it out for the first time. So I guess we're going to see how it goes. Now, we were also challenged to use some drop cloth in our projects, and I'm going to be adding in some other, just just a touch of spookiness into the trinket dish that we just created. What I'm doing here is I'm just taking some extra scraps that I had of drop cloth. I've mentioned this before. I use drop cloth as the base of my craft table or underneath my craft table, and I save it as it gets a lot of paint on it to use up the ends. So I am taking this popsicle stick that has a little wood round on it. And I almost created I guess you could say it almost looks like a little lollipop. And I am going to be cutting the drop cloth to put on either side of this little lollipop thing that I've created. Now I'm going to take the hot glue and I am going to put that hot glue inside of the two pieces of drop cloth, but on the edges of that circle, and then pinch it together to close in all around the top part of the circle. So I'm not going to close off the bottom part, just I guess the top half of the circle. Then I'm cutting around that top half to create kind of that round shape that I want at the top of this. If you haven't figured it out yet, I am making some mini ghosts to put inside of the decor piece that I created or to use with other things around my house just to give things a spooky touch around Halloween without going overboard. I did something similar to this, but in a bigger form. So ones that people could hang on the walls last year. I got the idea from Julie at Julie's Designs and Signs, so I cannot take credit, but I wanted to see if I could make a mini version of this. So once I have it cut to the shape that I want, I am going to cut slits through the drop cloth to kind of make the wispy bottom that I want to achieve on this ghost. I will say that ripping the drop cloth on a bigger piece is much easier than on a piece this small. So what I ended up doing was just cutting it and then using my little finger sander to distress or create that more shaggy look that I want on the bottom of this ghost. I then grab some trim or some of this lace scrap that I had in my stash, and I am going to cut strips of it that is similar in length, maybe even a little bit longer, maybe some pieces a little shorter, to hot glue in between the front and back pieces of drop cloth, just to add a little bit more texture and effect to the wispiness of the bottom of our ghost. Now I'm going to use this Sharpie. It is a water-based Sharpie, and draw a little face onto our ghost, just the eyes and the mouth. And again, this is what I learned last year as the face that I found to be one of my favorite ghost faces. I'm sure it's probably pretty common, but it was new to me last year and I am loving it, and I want to do something similar again this year. And for our last step, we are going to put a little bow onto our ghost. I do end up making two of these and leave one as a boy and one as a girl. And here's a look at our finished projects. Next, we have this 18-inch scrapwood plank. This was somebody's trash that Kendra's sister-in-law found, and so she sent us a couple pieces each of this to use in a project. And I loved the color of the wood as is. So I'm going to leave the wood natural, and I'm going to use some stamps. These, oh my gosh, I always forget the name of the stamp, but I will leave it linked. It's an IOD stamp set. It's obviously the cursive script font, and they are rather large letters. And unlike the other letters that you would use from IOD, you're going to want to use these one at a time because you want to make sure that each of the stamps can overlap with each other to create that cursive font effect. I am using some White Swan by DIY, and I am painting my sponge with the paint, and then I'm going to be dabbing that sponge onto the stamp to stamp on the letters for hello. I do this painted onto the sponge effect instead of dabbing the sponge into the paint because it allows or it puts less paint onto the sponge, which then puts less of the paint onto the stamp. I've tried it other ways and it's always ended up being very splotchy for me. This has been the most effective way for me to use paint with my stamps. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp out each of those letters. I will show you one time where I overlap the letters so you can see how that looks. Well, of course, those ghosts has me thinking about fall, so I decided to pull this pumpkin mold by IOD, and I'm going to be casting both the large and the small pumpkins. I am using the amazing resin, which it sets in about 10 minutes, but I do want to ensure that when I pull them out of the mold that they are still not completely hardened, because when I put them on the piece, I am going to have some overlap. Now, here's something I did that I do not recommend doing. I glued with Tight Bond Quick and Thick, I glued on the larger of the two pumpkins before I painted it. That made it extremely challenging to paint, and because I had to be so careful not to get anything onto the wood behind it. And because that wood was raw, any paint that I got on there, it wouldn't have been as easy to wipe off. There would have absolutely been excess, which happened to me just a tad in a couple places, but not enough for it to ruin the project. It's just, I would suggest not having it glued down before you paint. So paint first, then glue. Lesson learned. I painted the larger pumpkin in Orange Crush by DIY. This smaller pumpkin is Queen Bee by DIY. And then the leaves on both of the pumpkins will be painted in Aviary by DIY. I do end up having to clear all of the items between coats. I also do that so that when I put the green on, if I have to wipe back any of the excess, like if I kind of go over, I mean, it is quite a task to paint these details on these pumpkins and make sure that you don't mess up. So it took quite a bit of time, but it was fun. It was actually pretty fun to do. Another thing I forgot to mention is I do paint the two stems in Oakum by Fusion. Now, this is an all-in-one mineral paint, which is why I actually painted it before I painted the aviary. It was the same idea. I wanted to make sure that the all-in-one paint was on there first because it would be a lot harder to wipe back than the clay-based paint that I have with the green, that aviary that I'll be using for the leaves, as well as the orange and yellow colors. I finished up, let it dry, and now before I glue on the second pumpkin, I am taking some dark wax by DIY and I will be waxing both of the pumpkins and wiping back the excess just to bring out any of the details. Another thing you'll notice is that the bottom right of my bigger pumpkin has kind of a piece missing. This was a part that had gotten a little bit messed up as I was pulling it out of the mold. And because I knew I was going to be covering it with the smaller pumpkin, I didn't really worry about it. You'll be able to see at the end how I'm masking that mistake that I made. The last crafting material we were challenged to use was any kind of brown paper bag or packaging paper. I have this round topper from a wine bottle. It's one of my favorite bottles of wine, and so I have a little stash of them. And I am going to wrap the entire piece with this the crinkled up brown paper. Because of the slickness of the plastic on here, I did spray seal it first with some clear matte by Rust-Oleum. And there are two different ways that I decided to do this project. So I had two of the bottle toppers. I did the first one using some Type Bond Quick and Thick, and then the second one I used some Decoupage glue. Basically, in the end, both ways worked out just fine. I cover the entire base, cover it with the paper, and then I end up covering the entire paper with some sort of sealer. You could use the decoupage glue, which could be like Mod Podge. You can use some polyacrylic sealer, just anything to seal it in and keep it from ripping. Just give it a little more added protection. Once that was dry, I took some of that lace and I'm going to be hot gluing the rim of both of these little, I don't know, pots that I've created out of my upcycled trash. I'm trying to stick to this theme, Kendra. I'm trying to use up any of the trash that I have in my stash just for you. I hope I'm making you proud right now. Okay, so once that is done, I took the excess of the paper bag or the brown paper and I tucked it into the little pots. And then on one of the two pots, I decided to flip it upside down and I'm going to take some of our additional scrap drop cloth that I have and I'm going to cut around the outside of the pot just enough so that I have enough excess to fold over the sides, but I'm going to be hot gluing that piece to the top or the bottom, however you want to think of it, of the pot. Once I have that cut down how I want it, I end up using my finger sander to kind of shabby the edges a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is take just the corners of each of the it ends up creating a little bit of a rectangle, right? So I take the four corners and I'm going to hot glue them down onto the cap or the little pot. I grabbed some bottle brush trees and then here is a look at our finished project. For the larger bottle brush tree, it is actually placed inside, it is not glued down. And then the other one is sitting on top of that little shabby rug that we created with the drop cloth, and it is hot glued. And of course, I couldn't do a Christmas project and not think of my wooden tags. So I took some of the extra of that drop cloth and I'm going to see how it looks if I hot glue it onto these wooden tags. I'm being very careful to put just a dab of hot glue around the edges. You do not want to glop it on because it will come through on that drop cloth and won't, it'll look really messy. So I was very mindful of it and it was great. It didn't come out at all. Now, I originally thought I was going to keep a lot of the shagginess around the sides, but it was just very hard to maintain that. So I trimmed all the way to the edges of the tags and then just use my finger sander to shabby them up a little bit. Now I'm going to take my scissors and poke a hole right where the hole on the tag is, and then some baker's twine, and I'm going to cut a bit of it and then kind of push through the little hole with my scissors to get that baker's twine through and then tie it in a knot both on the bottom and on the top. For these little tags, I am not adding a bead for a couple reasons. One, the tags are relatively small. I don't know if you can tell in this picture, but also, and more importantly, that baker's twine is going to be very hard to create a knot thick enough to ensure that the beads don't slip through. So it's just in these kind of cases, I decide not to use an extra bead or anything. It doesn't mean I won't for another project, but for just for today, that's what I decided. Because I'm not using any extra bead in or anything else. I'm going to, these would probably, because you guys always ask me how much I would sell them for. this is like scraps of things I had in my stash, right? So I'm looking at probably selling them for $1 each or three for $2. I also, instead of using any of the Scrabble tiles or the wooden letters that you've seen me use in the past, I am going to just be using some stamps. These are some of the little flower borders from the Apothecary Labels stamp set by IOD, and I'm just going to be stamping it on the top and the bottom of the tag, and then I can place my monogrammed letter in the middle. I decided to use the font from the Letterpress IOD stamp set. There's three different font styles. This is the one in the middle. And I think it turned out really great, but it feels like it needs something more. So I decided to take this tiny little dot from the top of the three letterpress fonts, and I am going to be inking it up with some green ink. Now I'm going to place that little dot in various places on each of the letter tags. I don't stick to a similar pattern just because each letter has a unique shape. So a shape, for example, for the S, the dots might look great on the left and the right of the letter, but for something like the M is way too wide to allow that to happen. So I just find, something that I think looks good. I end up not being so fond of I ended up doing the M, but that's okay. So that's what I ended up doing with most of the tags. However, I did want to show you some variety if you happen to have some of the other stamp sets. This is the Cozy IOD stamp set. It's a holiday release from I think like 2 years ago, and I am inking it up with some green ink, almost to give it like a sweater weather effect. I do it on the top and the bottom, and I do put the zigzags on in opposite directions. So when I ink it up the way that I did on the bottom, I flip it over so that it is the same in reverse on the top. I hope that makes sense. I then take some red ink and I ink up one of the letters from the top of the three letterpress fonts, and I place it in the center, and that's it. Easy peasy. So these are some great ways to use your stamp sets that are probably sitting in your stash and probably don't get used very much, especially the smaller ones. Thanks so much for watching. And now let's hop on over to Late Night Creations. I cannot wait to see what she did and what Leanne did with all of the same items that I had in today's video. Let's go. And don't forget, the 30% off the 30th of the month is going on now. Check out sparksofjoystudio.com and shop the sale.